There we go. Excellent. We're live. Isn't it brilliant? So, let me just make sure Discord is fine and it has started recording. Yes, it has. I might press that recording as well. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Season 2, Episode 3 of the Atypical Doctor podcast. So, on today's show, we actually have a returning guest. Obviously, he didn't learn the first time to ignore phone calls from me and WhatsApp messages at 2 o'clock in the morning, and so now he is now regretting it the second time round. So Rashad, you were one of my first guests when I first started the podcast 5 years ago, and it was still called the Atypical Anesthetist Podcast, which I thought was a fantastic name, but nobody could spell it, and so nobody would ever find it. You know. And if I remember correctly, we talked to Fluffy Politics. That's how I named it. So how do we find you on this stormy but sunny Monday morning, afternoon even?
Yeah, not so bad. I remember. I remember the. Was it 5 years ago? Was it surely that long ago?
It was that long
Um,
ago. It was just
uh,
before the COVID lockdown, or just after. It was around the date.
right. I guess a lot's happened since then. Starting with COVID and the multiple iterations of um, Boris and the Tory government.
Hmm.
There was the incident with the lettuce, and we have a new government subsequently
Yeah, the lettuce
with
and the woman who shall not be named.
yeah, he who shall not be named.
Yeah. So I mean,
Um,
so I
And we
remember,
had
but
the
we,
terrible
but we were.
Indian takeover of the UK,
Yeah. I mean,
with the Indian viceroy. Um, and then we've had, I guess, the what standard
I like that, the
to
Indian
crazy time in
viceroy.
politics.
Yeah.
Yeah, standard to Indian crazy politics is Britain goes for something boring, no matter what's happening in the world. And I think we have the the Labour version of John Major, maybe not quite, but something similar in what we have with Starmer.
That's an interesting analogy you've made, actually. Um, John Major had I mean, for people who don't know, he was the prime minister in the mid '90s who had kind of, in a sense, won a surprise election in '92 when everybody had thought Labour would get in, uh, the Kinnock's Labour Party, and he was the kind of guy who'd had a meteoric rise to fame, hadn't he? A couple of years prior, nobody knew who the hell he was. Then he was foreign secretary. Then he was chancellor. Then he was part of, though tangentially, I suppose, the ousting of Thatcher, and then found himself the beige candidate, as it were, from amongst the Tories, and nobody gave him a cat in hell's chance of winning, and yet he won.
I think everyone assumed to be Hasseltine.
Yeah, well, part of that was, yes. Part of was the fact that everybody thought that it would be Heseltine who would be the one who'd become the leader, and then when it was Major, he was kind of an unexpected guy who'd got in, and then it was like, well, is he even gonna win the election? But he did, and he had a really interesting story, wasn't he? Because he was from Brixton at a time when Brixton had white people. you know, so you can tell how long ago that was. Um, why do you think there's a parallel with Starmer then?
No, I think it's just the reassurance of a boring candidate. I think that's what people wanted then, and I think that's what people wanted after craziness with the Tories, as it was all over the place. And I think the reach for something sure, safe pair of hands is what people thought they were getting in Starmer. Little did they know what was going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, the Labour Party itself has changed massively from that winter of 2020, winter and spring. At that time it was, Boris had just won the 2019 election. Had Corbyn resigned yet? after that election by then, January,
I
February
don't, I
time?
think he took forever to resign, so I don't know what when we did it. I think he took forever to resign and to watch the process of change. It felt like that took longer than any election we've ever had in the country.
Hmm. It did take a while, didn't it? I mean, I think everybody's memory is a little bit fuzzy because of COVID and lockdowns and stuff. But yeah, no, I remember it took a while. And it was a bit of a spectacular fall from grace, wasn't it, for Corbyn? Having been, you know, not even on the ballot paper, had an unexpectedly good 2017 election. And then,
Unexpectedly good loss.
yes,
I think
he
people
still lost,
people
didn't he?
frame these things in very romantic terms.
Hmm.
He managed to get an exceptional turnout for the Tories.
Hmm.
And I think what happened after that was this fear of people that voted thinking he's going to lose anyway, realized, oh my God, we almost had this lunatic in power. So what we need to do is make sure he doesn't come in power again. And so 2019, we saw um, this defeat, and everyone at the time was saying it's going to take several elections for Labour to claw it back.
Hmm.
Um, how are they ever going to get those numbers back? And then we had this massive turnaround in the last election, and a huge, huge victory um, for Starmer and his
Yeah.
targeted collective
I mean,
strategy.
it seemed to me that um, I know the truth isn't exactly this, but there was a perception. There was a perception amongst some members of the public that Corbyn was some kind of revolutionary, some kind of messiah, all this kind of stuff. And I mean, he obviously wasn't. He's not the messiah. He's just a naughty boy, as Monty Python would have said. Yeah, and when what Starmer seemed to have learned was you need to be as establishment as possible and learn how to play the numbers game of first past the post
I think
because
the last point I think is true. He learned how to target, and I think the Lib Dems did that very well.
yeah.
They had a really successful election, and I think between them there was this kind of comeback on the left.
Hmm.
People were talking about how well reform were going to do, and they ended up just being winning nothing, basically getting five seats. Um, Obviously, it took a long time for the media establishment to get over that because they were hyping it up for so long.
Hmm.
They were obviously upset at their failed estimations.
Hmm.
And they kept going on about it. And they still do to a large extent give massive portrayal to this really fringe party. And they downplayed the success of the Lib Dems, and they downplayed they attempted to downplay the success of the Labour Party victory. I think that's absolutely true, and I think the other side of it is that there was this very kind of like steering towards what is safe,
Hmm.
small p conservative influence and impact on where the Labour Party should go.
I mean, I always got the feeling that everybody was just sick and tired of the previous administration and the chaos and the kind of lack of clue, if you know what I mean. That
Yeah, I think they've been sick and tired of it for a long time.
yeah.
I think they were sick and tired of it in 2015, and 17 and 19. I think they've been sick and tired of it for a long time. I think the issue is that you had an unelectable leadership. You know, anybody who had any sense in politics was telling them that this is an unelectable leadership because the British public, when it comes to electoral process, is very careful and considered. Which is why, as you started off, you mentioned about how everyone was expecting Kinnock to win.
Hmm.
Not everyone.
Okay.
A lot of the press at the time, the press is a good indicator, not of when they support someone, it doesn't indicate they're backing them. It indicates they know this person is going to win.
Hmm.
One of the things that was shown with the Sun is that they are a good at reading, like a bellwether. This is
Yeah.
the direction of
A good
travel,
barometer of
a
where
good
things are going.
barometer of what's going on. And so I think their headline was, "Will the last person leaving the United
Killers
Kingdom turn
turn
the
the lights
lights.
off. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and um, and I think that was indicative of reading what the popular vote perception still was of Kinnock and the Labour Party was they still hadn't rid themselves of militant, and Kinnock lacked leadership.
Hmm.
I remember there's this exchange towards the end of the major government where the Tories were losing votes in Parliament
Hmm.
because of the backbenchers uprising, and there's this exchange between John Major and Kinnock, and uh, I believe it was Kinnock that said, "You're just a sore loser,"
Hmm.
and John Major got up and he said, "Well, I don't have years of experience of it like you do," or words to that effect. And it was quite an amusing, especially for a very grey, boring man. It was quite an amusing comeback.
Yeah.
And I think that general instinct of the British public is to play it safe.
Hmm.
And I think the only reason um, the Tories were in so long for so long with May, etc., was not because people supported or were excited by the prospect of Theresa May or any of these people. It was just this is there was no alternative on the table as far as they were concerned.
Okay. People who supported Boris Johnson though in 2019 would say different, wouldn't they? They would say that this was a vote for Boris. He got a lot of these so-called red wall seats. These established Labour heartland seats, which were now going Tory. So,
Yeah, I think
so
I,
how the
I, I don't know.
how would
I
you?
don't think so.
You don't think so?
I
Okay,
don't think so.
okay.
No. I mean, I think there's a number of different reasons. One is, like you said, there was, you know, these Labour heartland seats, which they felt a Labour Party was very far away from them.
Mm-hmm.
Progressive Labour was very far away from the interests of the average working person.
Yeah.
This is like a perception,
Metropolitan woke Twitterati, etc.
etc. That kind of thing. North London elite. This
Mm.
is the perception. Corbyn is my MP. Um, and
Have you met him
the
recently?
other side. Sorry.
Have you met him recently as your MP?
I haven't met him recently. I have met him a number of times before.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there was also this kind of like the lingering reactionary Brexit sentiment.
Yeah.
That there was a lack of surety about all those reasons that people felt about Brexit, which included things like stopping mass migration, which included things like concentrating on the local areas
Mm-hmm.
rather than being Europe focused. There was this reaction to and constant drip feed of anti-immigration sentiment that fed into all of those voters.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there was, in pockets and areas, there was very strong reasons why people looked at, distinct reasons why they couldn't vote for Corbyn's party, even if they supported the MPs.
Mm-hmm.
So there was scenarios where I remember having conversations with people, and it was very simply, if you go to places like Birmingham is a good example of this.
Mm-hmm.
Birmingham suffered attacks under the IRA.
Mm-hmm.
The sentiment
Yeah.
in places is very strong. And then you had John McDonnell and Corbyn, who were not, like they were not just apologists for the IRA, they were pro IRA and defensive of them in lots of different ways, and still decided, even years later, to bring this up.
Mm.
And so that has a negative dampening effect on those communities. Salisbury, obviously, you had the incident of the Russians using
Yeah.
chemical weapons to assassinate British assets and so on. And you had Corbyn saying maybe we should get the Russians to investigate this.
Mm.
I mean, this just not only does it sound ludicrous and stupid and ignorant, but it scares people about putting the security of our country in
Mm.
that person's um, hands. And then there was also, I think, this, sentiment of, there's a group of old school Labour establishment people who just couldn't be trusted. I mean, if you remember the height of this, the Diane Abbott's, inability to pronounce numbers and
Yeah.
you know the likes of McDonnell and Richard Bergen hardly inspires any kind of confidence in leadership. Um, and there was just this general fear of this is still the front of that party. How could they possibly govern? And the one person who kind of somehow managed to ride it out was Starmer. He managed to be part of the Corbyn cabinet, shadow cabinet, whilst being critical of the persuasion, and have these both feet in both camps. And so he still tried until he took power to be able to say, well, I don't want to eliminate the hard left or even more left wing strands of the Labour Party. Where he took the line of Tony Blair back in the 90s, when Blair was asked ironically, about Corbyn. And he said, we're a broad church.
Yeah.
And I think up until he felt strong enough to get rid of them, I think he played that game well enough tactically to have both feet in both camps, and then eventually take over from that to ensure some kind of continuity, but also be the safe bet. And also, there was 5 women, I think, or 4 women that stood against him, and 1 man. And the Labour Party obviously is never going to appoint a woman. Well, not in our experiences. And so he won the leadership contest.
It's a bit ironic, isn't it, that the Conservative Party has had all the female prime ministers of varying competence, and Labour can't even elect one as an opposition leader.
3 female prime ministers, and 1, prime minister whose ethnic origin is Turkish, and 1 prime minister whose ethnic origin is Indian.
Yeah.
And visibly Indian. I mean, he looks brown, and it's fascinating because remember all this rhetoric about, it'll take Corbyn's leadership to unlock your potential as an ethnic minority and all this kind of nonsense. Whereas actually, it has this resistance, and even when it comes to things like how much representation does it have in the black community in its parliamentary ranks, it's still very minimalistic.
Yeah, I mean, and the Conservative leader, who is quite incompetent, but she is Nigerian, very visibly Nigerian.
She did tell us we're not allowed to call her Nigerian.
Yes. She said that she no longer identifies as Nigerian, and I was kind of like, I no longer identify as fat. I'm transgender. That was my report. But it is an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? And I wonder whether it's because the Labour Party has to do more to seem mainstream, while you can't get more mainstream than the Conservative Party. They don't need to push for how British they are because it's the Conservative Party, while the Labour Party has to kind of, no true Scotsman fallacy, isn't it?
A little bit. I think there's a little bit overcorrection. It's a little bit like the Dems in the US. They have to be harsh and hard on law and order because they're seen as liberal softies. They have to be, overly, show overtures to the Israeli government all the time, persistently, because they are the party that's seen as supposed to be hostile to it, or not its natural leadership, naturally associated with it. And I think here in the UK, there's a little bit of that. I think that's true. That there's a fear, a little bit like how I think Tories are afraid of being racist. I mean, whether they are institutionally racist or not is a point of I don't think it's a point of contention really, but I'm sure people will argue it. But they are afraid of being perceived in that light or labelled with that. And I think the Labour Party has always had. I mean, even now, the left struggles to present itself as truly patriotic without being, on the other side of that, without being nationalist.
But is I remember, but is it not
Ed Miliband's mug?
Oh yeah.
Ed Miliband held with anti-immigration mugs. Even Corbyn now still has this very reactionary anti-migration stance.
Yeah. I mean, I remember Brown with when he was Chancellor with his British jobs for British workers.
Yeah.
And yeah, I
And that's
mean,
the rhetoric they adopt, and they have to because they see this as kind of like, look, we're patriotic too. Um,
but
up
is there
until the
not?
point where the cameras are turned off, and then Brown turns around and says that bigoted woman,
Yeah,
and talking about someone who is making overtly racist statements, which is more reassuring because it shows you actually what his natural sentiment is better than his public sentiment,
yeah, yeah,
as opposed to the other way around,
yeah,
where people hide their horrendous private sentiments and try to sell themselves as more noble and better than they are.
yeah. I mean, I suppose the counter for that kind of policy of trying too hard, as it were, which like you mentioned about Labour and the Democratic Party actually in America as well, is people would just kind of go, why should I take Diet Coke when I can just have Coke? You know,
Exactly. And I think that's really, really key. I mean, you're really onto a big point here. It's why Labour will never win over reform voters in that
exactly.
way
It's not
because
going to happen. If you're a
why,
if you're a racist xenophobe, then you'd vote for a racist xenophobic party. I'm not saying reform. My point is, you will go where you actually believe, and if people are wavering on one side or the other, again, why would you go for the light version when you can have the proper version? I remember this was one of the things actually that really brought that home to me. My last episode was also a political conversation, but it was with probably the only two Democrats in Texas, you know, and
oh, I watched that.
yeah, and I have thoughts about that. But anyway, one of the things was I saw some of the Democrat campaign adverts for the election. And it was, look at me, look at all the guns that I have, and look all the shooting that I do, and I'm a committed member of my church, and I go there, and I'm there helping out at social refugees or whatever, and it's
Yeah.
kind of like you're trying to be Republican light, and if you're going to be Republican light, people are just going to vote Republican, you know.
I think some of that is, I think that's true. I think a lot of that is true here in the UK, that you're never going to win over that side because they will look at you and they look at the propaganda.
Hmm.
So the propaganda is saying you're doing X. You are not dealing with the migration problem. You are a progressive party that is really, takes care of minorities more than white population. You don't care about the traditional working class, i.e., white people. This is all of this propaganda comes out all the time, and then for you to pretend to adopt it and then go back and forth about it is just the worst of all worlds.
Hmm.
So if you remember Starmer's speech, which people say he didn't mean to use phrases like "islands of strangers" to echo, Norman Tebbit and the like. It was just happened by accident. It just means you're pretty incompetent, and your communications team is pretty incompetent,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah. I mean,
So
and I think people have
level.
difficulty believing that because of the fact that he was a human rights lawyer, director of public
Yeah,
prosecutions. He's been an MP. So
yeah.
either he really is
Think
very incompetent, which is true.
they were utterly crap at communicating anything.
Say that again. Sorry.
So if they slick all the time and they
Mm.
were able to communicate their policies and their politics. And then here there was a slip and they said, oh, we didn't mean to say that. It was just inadvertent. Um, then you'd say, no, actually, here's the evidence that shows you're on top of public sentiment. Your rhetoric is well thought through. You explain your policies and politics in a way that reaches both the average person and the interested person. You have thought through ideas about what to do in every single area of economics, of social policy, of global politics. But actually, they don't. They go back and forth on absolutely everything. So he took back that statement and he regretted using that language. So you kind of like you appeal to the racists and then you say, I didn't mean to be racist. So you reassure the racists that you're not really on their side. And you also put off people.
Put doubts in the minds of the people who are like, oh my god, he's a racist.
He is a racist. And they've done the same thing on every single key issue when it was the kind of like welfare bill.
Mm-hmm.
We have to do this. We have to save a few £billion here. Otherwise, why would we consider putting extra decisions and criteria to restrict how disabled people access welfare benefits. And then you look at it and you see there's no data that demonstrates there's a lot of cheating going on in the first place. It's actually very minimal. And then you see what they're likely to save is very minimal. And then they get pressured from it because of the likely consequences on people.
Mm-hmm.
And then they back down.
Mm.
So you have the worst of all worlds for government. I remember, when after October 7th happened, Star was asked about, Israel is besieging
Yeah, I
Gaza.
remember that.
And he instinctively said, oh, Israel has the right to defend itself. And it's like, but we're asking you about besieging Gaza. And he said, look, they were, and he just went back to this kind of like default position. And then afterwards, and then obviously Emily Thornberry defended it. So actually the party line was to defend it. And then when he was asked about specifics, he says, oh, I didn't mean they have the right to do that, because always that's a war crime. What I meant was just generically they can do, they're allowed to defend themselves. And it's like, well, not only did you win and lose both sides of this argument, you've demonstrated how easy it is to support war crimes. You've then had your members and your party members defend you, and take a stance of defending war crimes, and then you've made everyone look bad. And there's, the subsequent consequence of that as well in terms of real politics. So all of this, they just seem incompetent. They seem incapable of articulating a vision. I don't think they have one. And I think people look at the opposition and they think, dear God, it's awful. And they're still fighting amongst themselves, to be whether they want to be full on reform and more extreme than reform in the kind of like the generic camp, or whether they want to sound like libertarian right wingers, which is failing and falling on deaf ears with what Badenoch wants to do.
So, I mean, it is an interesting situation that we find ourselves in, we had the election last year. Bloody hell, it's been a year. Starmer gets 31% of the national vote, yet ends up with a massive majority because of, as we've said, he played the game very well. The Tory vote collapsed. People who, Tory voters are generally, they always come out, and they didn't come out. Many decided to go for reform. You ended up with reform with 5 seats with about 15% of the vote. The Lib Dems, because they could play the game, also got 15% of the vote, but got about 70 seats. Okay. One of the things that was said at the time, and I just wonder what your views about it is there not a democratic deficit that we have when we can end up with a government which theoretically could do whatever it wanted to on the basis of those results? And then on top of that, the fact that they could but have not been able to is also a interesting point, isn't it?
They could but not been able to what, sorry?
So if you've got a majority of 150, right, you'd expect that you can bloody do whatever you want. You could make, change the name of Sunday to, HP Phillips presents Sunday at Church Day, and theoretically you could get it through,
Yeah.
And yet they've not been able to. So
I think that's good. That's really key. I think it's not being able to, but they haven't had the imagination and the will. The imagination to be able to see what you can do and then drive it home. I mean, things like the budget that we've had have been utterly horrendous.
Yeah.
People at the time were saying why this is going to slow down the economy when you're trying to create incentivization for economic growth. The net result will be, and we've seen it now, basically the beginnings of recession, as opposed to actually driving home an economy. They could easily have come forward and said, we now see the state of our internal affairs. We are going to need to spend more. We may need to be able to do that via taxation or borrowing, and probably borrowing, because we don't want to increase taxation. And that would allow more stimulus to the economy. It would continue to push it in the right direction. We don't need to stick by these decisions that we made because we were lied to about the state of internal affairs. that would have been an easy argument to make, and they would been able to persist in it, but they didn't. I
And also, you know, I think I remember the world has changed a lot just in the year and a bit that they've been in power. You know, we've got, you know, the orange baby over in America. You know, there was loads of opportunities and things to say. Look, not only the government finances we were lied to, they're not as rosy as the Conservatives tried to say, which they weren't rosy anyway. But even they, you know, they were polishing a turd. And now
Yeah, they're
the
much worse than we
yeah,
expected.
yeah, and then the geopolitical situation is crazier as well because now you know there's going to there's issues with the Ukraine war and the deal of NATO where you're going to have to increase our defense spending, you know, all these things. It's like you were given on a platter your reasons for saying, okay, we had these plans based on these things. The world has changed. It isn't as good as we
Yeah,
thought or as bad as we thought. It's even worse. Let's make a change, and yet they didn't. They've
yeah,
straight Reeves has specifically straitjacketed herself.
yeah. And I think it's not just on the economy. The economy is a big thing, but you're right on all of the big issues that affect us. You know, in terms of what's the transatlantic relationship with the US? How are we going to survive that? You know, how are we going to regroup together with other allies? Whether that's the Canadians, the French, the Germans. How do we play a role of seeing what our key issues are with human rights in the world, especially with a regressive American leadership?
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, there's all sorts of issues, obviously, with the ongoing devastation in Gaza by the Israeli government,
Mm-hmm.
and so all of these things where principal stances could have been taken haven't been taken,
Mm-hmm.
where positions which are allow us to be able to step back and say, this is what we need to do with our economy, this is what we need to do with NATO, this is where we need to rethink how we're going to be supplying arms to Ukraine, this is how we need to rethink about our stance on international politics, this is how we may be distant from the current White House for a term, etc. There's all sorts of issues there. There's all sorts of opportunities and challenges, because with challenges come opportunities. And I think and the other point that you mentioned just before this one was the democratic deficit. I think it's a real thing in politics where your elected representatives aren't just merely there to represent your views, they're there to lead and give you leadership and direction.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that balance between saying, well, actually, the popular opinion says X, so we're going to do this, and actually recognizing the popular sentiment may be in this direction, but really we as the leadership think you need to go in this direction, and this is why.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that is lacking in a government that's too afraid of, to challenge anything that's in the popular sentiment. Um,
Why do you think they're
so I
like
think that
that? Why do you think they're like that?
why do we live in an era of invertebrate politics,
Yeah.
spineless leadership? I don't know. I mean, I wish I had like a simple answer, but I think there's something to do with the intellectual caliber that's lacking in this kind of crop of politicians. I think we're obviously not attracting people to go into politics. It's not very attractive to go into politics, to be fair.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a smart, intelligent bloke, you're going to become you'd rather be an consultant, anaesthetist than actually earn more money that way than going into politics and earn next to nothing. There's all sorts of things. It's not next to nothing, but relatively
Yeah,
speaking,
yeah.
if you're intelligent, your talents will be rewarded in other spaces, in business, in banking, in medicine, in all sorts of things. Whereas you're not going to get that back in politics. But maybe that's a good thing, because maybe you want to attract people that want to do well and have the right intent to go into it.
Mm-hmm.
But also it leads into having establishment people who may be billionaires and therefore they've got nothing to win or lose.
Mm.
And also maybe I don't have that much of a stake in the impact that their policies have, e.g. Sunak.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of reasons for that, I think. But um,
Is it the
the,
initiate? Is it, you know, you hear this term a lot in technology, you know, the inshitification of things. And sometimes I just wonder whether the country as a whole seems to be, because I don't want to come out. I don't want to be conspiratorial, as they say. You know, conspiracy theories are the last refuge of the idiot, and I don't want to think that people are malicious, but it is true that things aren't happening, and the only other explanation is incompetence. And so it's like, well, where did the competent people go? You made a good point. Why would you be a jobbing constituency MP when you could quite easily have another job doing something else? I mean, it would be stupid, frankly. If I told my wife now, I'm going to join my local Labour Party and I'm going to try and stand for a councillor, she'd probably kick me out. It's like, well, why would you?
So I think there's all sorts of reasons like that, and I think the other side of this is the general direction of public discourse and decline intellectually within our public discourse. I think you can see this with the Overton windows just expanded so wide. Some of that is reflected in the way social media allows random people to gain massive influence and random nonsensical, baseless thinking to gain following. So in the past, if you believe the earth was flat, you believe the earth was flat. People may laugh and joke at you. It doesn't really affect anything. And you don't know other people. You might, if you really try very hard, find the flat earth society or something and meet some people, maybe a handful of people. Now you go online and you find a community group on Facebook and on Twitter and social media, and suddenly you can share your idiocy with millions of other people around the globe. And that networking communal feel can give you a sense of belonging, identity, purpose. And that happened, we saw with the kind of like the COVID conspiracism, the lunacy about not following those measures and the damage that did. I mean, I literally had, still every now and then come across it with people and I end up saying, I had like cousins that my age or a couple of years older that died from COVID. And it's like, this is what happened. This is what we were affected by. This is a reality. But this type of idiocy can join with other people. Um, and now in the US can lead a government, with like so RFK Jr. And in the UK, it's still within the hard left and the far right of our politics, is now in the centre ground. So it's the centre of British politics that has generic, just spouting all sorts of conspiracism and nonsense, whether it's about crime, whether it's about immigration. The Times had an article a couple of days ago about 1 in 8 of migrants are, I can't remember if it was in 1 in 8 prisoners are from migrant backgrounds or something like that. I can't remember the exact title, but the stat was a nonsense thing. It was like, well, 1 in 5 are working in our public sector. They're doctors, nurses, and it's the lack of recognition of the reality of our dependency on migration to run our economy and our social structures is just completely lost because of the irrational conspiracism about the far right replacement theory. And all that kind of politics has entered there. And you see this we had idiots talking about, we had people like, what's his name? Owen Jones, as an example, writing for The Guardian that the Tories should be afraid because Russell Brand is supporting the Labour Party. The guy's a moron. He's wanted right now for statutory rape, and there's a case that will be going on, so we can't really discuss it. He came in, at one point he was saying, don't take part in politics at all and don't vote at all.
Yeah, I remember.
It's like, this guy's a moron, is an idiot. But, people on that side of the politics thought, oh, well, he's anti-establishment and supporting another anti-establishment candidate. It's like, well, you just opened the Overton window so far that any idiot can get in. And that's part and parcel of the general decline of it. So, yeah, I think all of these things mean there's what isn't an acceptable strand of thinking becomes acceptable. Whether it's lunacy, racism, whether it's proto-fascism, whether it's hard left idiocy, reactionary politics, all those things have bigger stake in our public space now than they did. So the centre's a bit like the cricket.
So how does the Labour Party get to some kind of sanity then? And what I mean by sanity, I mean, okay, maybe that's the wrong word to use. How do they get to being effective and competent government? Because that is a thing that, is you hear that from lots of people. That we thought we thought we were getting rid of the incompetent people, and we've just ended up with different incompetent people.
Yeah, I think we got rid of a completely incompetent group that didn't care about anything.
Mm-hmm.
So that last government, they didn't do anything. Their entire portfolios where they're now jumping on the back of, like things like the state of our prisons is so horrendous. And they were criticizing the current government as
And
like,
it's like, where were you for
but
14 years? Yeah.
you were in 14 years. And moreover, you knew the stats and the figures of criminals and the inability to imprison all the inmates. There was going to be a problem. And then when governments made decision to release non-violent criminals early or etc. or shorten sentences, they were criticized for it. It's like, well, you watched this happen and literally were warned about it and you didn't do anything. And the reason you didn't do anything is because you weren't bothered.
Yeah. You couldn't
Fundamentally, it's
care.
like
Yeah, they didn't care.
you couldn't care less. Maybe you could care less, but it was hard. It's scraping the barrel.
Yeah.
They didn't care enough to do anything.
Mm.
And so the fact is, you've got that combination of people that just weren't interested in doing anything, and were also really horrendous human beings. I think that side of it really shone through with the types of personalities that were in power.
Trust,
It was seen
especially.
in that way.
Trust is just delusional. Poor girl needs to
Yeah,
be put in a home or something.
or somewhere where but trust a good example of this is what we were talking about earlier about the Overton window where she'll just write utter nonsense and it'll be published in the Telegraph or
Yeah,
whichever newspaper.
the left wing economic establishment got her out, and it's just like, oh my
Yeah,
lord.
yeah, so stuff like that it's just insane, and you think, how does this happen? So I think there's some of that, and I think when you step back and you think, how can we do anything? It's like, yeah, there is when they first came in, that one of the things they did is they selected interesting individuals
Mm-hmm.
for positions on like prison reform. They
Yeah.
had interesting people to come and lead on this, people that had a background in taking in rehabilitation as a serious issue. So their selection seemed quite positive. I was surprised at how well they'd thought this through.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, they never followed through with anything meaningful in terms of reform agenda. I think there's a lack of trust in government, and that's going to persist as long as arguments are not made to the British public on principal stances and representation is not done properly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we haven't spoken about it yet, but 80% of the British public is unhappy with the actions of the Israeli government.
Yeah,
and they don't support supporting it. And our government has been very, very slow and weak on that. 45% positively want a recognition of a Palestinian state. Only 14% surveyed don't.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the other half don't really know or don't care, the other third or whatever it may be. So there's a real reality there of kind of like disparity between aspirations of the British public, moral persuasions of the British public, and the way that translates into policy. And so that's always going to have even worse impact on politics for the fringes. So if you're young and you're more principled and idealistic, you're naturally going to be at odds with governments anyway.
Mm-hmm.
When you see this happening, it's going to make that much, much worse, as it has done and as it does do. So I think that a democratic deficit issue has to be tackled in the way the politics is done and in the way representation takes place. I think, ironically, it was killed after the last election result because nobody wants 15% of reform manifestation in the vote or anything like that. Not 15%, or whatever the percentage is. And the same with, they're happy with the Lib Dems to play that game and be more successful. If anything, there was a shift within the right, inside it, to divide between more centrist and more right wing. And on the left, there was a greater growth of outreach and success on the left vote. So I don't think it is a shift to the right per se.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just presented like that with people that want to make reform a bigger thing than it is. At the same time, they are a they are doing well in terms of like, their leadership is seen as more in touch. Ironically, this horrendous human being is seen as more in touch with the British electorate than Starmer.
Mm.
Um, and then you have the response from the hard left side is that they form a party where they can't even name their party. They can't even
Yeah.
decide who the leader of their party. They have to
Yeah.
stick with the old white man to take power because, God forbid, anybody else does it. And they are appealing to you know, the basis sentiments of kind of small-minded left thinking. So they're still talking about British workers and British rights and aspirations for the traditional working class. And it's kind of like, okay, this fits with that worldview, but it's utterly horrendous. And they're manipulating the feelings and emotions of people, speaking of Israel,
Yeah.
particularly within Muslim communities, but also on the left, who are very, very angry about having a government that basically has facilitated in many respects what the Israelis are doing, or hasn't even spoke out strongly
Yeah.
or principally on what the Israelis are doing, even though other governments in Europe and the West have.
Yeah. I
Even
mean,
if they're not really doing anything meaningful, the language has resonated with the public perception and sentiment um, of their societies.
yeah. I mean, this was something I wanted to ask actually, which is, about how, the British public in general, of whatever background, as you say, are a lot more sympathetic to what's happening in Palestine, and Gaza, than the way that the governments have been. And I don't understand why people like Starmer, people like, all these other, peoples in positions of power have been so reluctant to say or do anything. And it's not just in the UK, other places as well. It's just, I mean, you'd expect Trump to be Trump and say whatever he says. Do you know what I mean? But the Dems in there in America as well, and it's just like,
Yeah.
but this is not what the public believe. Do you know what I mean? The public, you go and you find some random geezer on the street, as you're saying, they'll be far more sympathetic. You know.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the surveys and research that's done in this area shows that. I think there's always a lag between popular sentiment and political leadership, but I think the lag here is much bigger. In places like Germany, there's a huge lag between what the popular sentiment is and what the German government stance has been. The German establishment stance in the media and the judiciary and the politicians has been quite horrendous. They've taken a reactionary anti-Arab racist position, and they've spread that across into the public statements of ministers, into the public statements of judges talking about remigration, into the people talking about policies in different states, because they have this multiple
Yeah, yeah,
statelets
yeah.
in Germany,
Federal.
federal approach where you have to identify as being a Zionist almost in order to gain citizenship rights by saying you believe in the preservation of the state of Israel, which is a very strange position to have. Um, some of that is to do with the reaction. Obviously, German history,
Mm,
anti-Semitism, they see as part of their raison d'etre now is to preserve and protect Jews, and therefore, ergo, that means Israel. Um, some of that is to do with just the racist nature of European societies, and German societies still scratch the surface, very racist, and you're seeing that in the way it manifests. And some of that is just to do with the way the popular sentiment has been repressed in Germany, whether it's in media circles or political circles, and the rhetoric that they pushed. So what you've had now for the first time is the Freitag coming out and calling it genocide. You've had
mm.
the first, statements being made in the media about this. Up until this time, no one has largely been critical of the Israeli government. In Spain, you have the opposite. You have a government that's been vociferously strong against the actions of the Israeli government. And it's come out and it's called for sanctions within the EU. In France, you see this oscillation with Macron, as
Mm.
Macron 1 week is, we don't know which Macron you're going
Yeah,
to
yeah,
get this week,
yeah.
basically. 1 week is let's be friends with Russia. The next week is we're at war with Russia. 1 week is Trump and him are best mates and they're hugging. And the week after, we need to relieve, we need to reestablish a new leadership with outside of the US. We can't depend on them. And so at the moment, Macron is pushing for recognition and has successfully managed to get the Canadians on board
Mm-hmm.
and Starmer on board to be able to say we will recognize the Palestinian state in September, but also almost as if saying, unless you slow down on the genocide, we're going to do this, which is a very strange thing to do on multiple levels, which is kind of like, well, if it is wrong, it's wrong.
Yeah,
If people have a right to being recognized, they have a right to be recognized. They don't need,
yeah.
um, you know,
I mean, it
this to
sounds.
be
I mean,
stopped. It should happen anyway.
I mean,
And
what
also,
was the
we
is
should
a
do something to
yeah,
stop this, irrelevant of recognition of the
yeah,
Palestinian state. We
yeah.
need to do something to stop this. So I think all of that shows how it's problematic as a kind of policy thinking. And I think some of that is to do with Starmer himself and how he views his kind of like establishment persuasion and his thinking about the kind of Israel bias is really interesting because Israel is a normal country, isn't it? It's like Western countries, a democracy, it's a liberal state, it's one of us.
Hmm.
And so the implied assumptions in all of those things mean it will be viewed at through that lens. And until that, eventually, with many people that look at this, they will start from there and eventually will crack because they will look at like, you know, the atrocities, the 20,000 killed. They will look at starvation as a policy, stated policy.
Hmm.
The reignition, the reaffirmment of starvation as a policy yesterday by Netanyahu in certain areas and not other areas. So they're using aid as a means of fulfilling their policy of annexation and controlling the strip
Hmm.
and concentrating people into the strip. And these things are stated overtly, and it's got to the point where we had Lord Sumpton, the former Attorney General, former Supreme Court judge in the UK, writing a very sober articulation of why the intent of genocide has been made by ministers, by government ministers, by President, by Netanyahu, etc. By the policy actions of starvation demonstrate it, the consequences of the tens of thousands of children and women killed, and the disproportionate number of individuals that have been murdered by the government. And they may not say they don't like the word killed or government there. What's the word? Unintended consequences of their targeting of Hamas. When it turns out 1 in 30 or 1 in 20 or 1 in 10 is the ratio of acceptable killings for their targeted,
Hmm.
assassinations. And it just becomes more and more ludicrous and harder to believe that thousands of people or 1,000 people can be killed in a matter of weeks just going to get aid.
Hmm.
It's become so far and so obvious and so horrendous that the Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem
Yeah.
and the Physicians for Human Rights, who came out and did an extensive report about what happened on October 7th as well,
Hmm.
and now coming out and saying, well, this is a genocide, what's happening
Yeah.
to Palestinians. And it's broken through in Israeli society, yet our government and our ministers, our foreign office is still lagging behind in being able to recognize what these are. Not sure if war crimes are being committed. Not sure if it's a genocide because they can't say that. You have a scenario where the former prime minister of Israel comes out, Olmert, and says it's a war of devastation against civilians.
Yeah.
And
I mean, there was one thing that I saw
we're not
today
sure
from
if
a
there's
couple
any
of
war
days ago.
crimes committed.
Yeah, I mean, there was a statement from a bunch of military leaders, which included Ehud Barak and Moshe Dayan was his name, I think. Basically
Yeah.
saying that this war needs to stop because there are no more military objectives for us to get.
Yeah, and in fact, I think
The Hamas is
they went
strategically
further
being
and
a
said
threat.
we're losing.
Yeah,
Yeah, so we're making errors. We're going to be losing, and I think there's some criticism: is this political to do Netanyahu? Is like, is this talking about Israeli national interests? It's not talking about in principle of humanitarian grounds. And somebody I saw online who sees this as a humanitarian disaster and sees this as war crimes being committed says, well, you're only going to push the needle in Israel by talking about it in national interest terms.
hmm
So that's why they're doing that,
hmm
which I can, whatever happens, that happens. But I think part of this problem is just the way uh, that translates is that you have a strong criticism coming about what's happening in terms of the consequences, but not in terms of who's the active agent performing the consequences.
Mm.
So Starmer, seeing that starvation is horrendous humanitarian catastrophe, doesn't see that the policies of a government are directly leading to that as part of their ongoing war, and it's a war strategy and tactic which they've spoken of.
Mm.
Um, and yet, there's a not pointing out reinforces this kind of you are just utterly horrendous, aren't you? You don't care about human rights. You don't care about international norms. You don't care about international law. You don't care about the ICC and the ICJ. You will call out Ukrainian genocide. You'll call out Ukrainian war crimes. But then here you'll say, well, we need a court judgment on Israel. Why the double standards?
Mm.
And that comes across very, very strongly, very, very clearly. And to, it further adds to the disenfranchisement on the far right, the hard left, and the center. The center is breaking even more. So it's Tory MPs who are standing up in Parliament saying to Labour backbenchers, you need to call your leadership out. We can't do this. They're not going to listen to us. We're the opposition. You need to do this to stand up against them and stop this government's continual support. And that is an interesting thing to see within the center of our politics. In the US, 72% of the Democrats do not support Israeli action. It's now the US electorate, it's fallen within the Republican side, I think, to about 40 or 42%. So it's sorry, I got those figures wrong. It's fallen amongst the Democrats to something like 90% do not support what Israel is doing amongst the Democratic vote. In the side of the Republicans is down to 72%. And what that is 46% of the American population does not, has backs what Israel is doing. The rest do not. So it's this whole scenario where the public opinion and the public persuasion no longer supports these actions. And the failure to translate that into policy further distances people from any confidence in international norms, international institutions, governments, and therefore further radicalizes people.
Just one last point on the whole Israel-Palestine thing. This whole idea of recognition, is it just words? I mean, what does it actually mean to recognize the state of Palestine? Really, what does it mean?
Okay, my personal view, I don't think it translates into much, because most of there's 100 plus countries, 150 they say, I'm not sure how many countries in the world that already recognize the Palestinian state. It's not a state. It doesn't exist as a state. So it hasn't translated into bringing it about. So in that sense, I'm not sure it's not going to bring it about all of a sudden that Canada, France, Britain recognize it. It will bring them back up to a normal stance of saying we believe in the right of people to self-determination. That basic human right will be recognized. So I think there's that. That does sound symbolic. But actually, diplomatically, you saw Netanyahu's reaction, the desperate kind of anger towards his allies. So in that sense, I think there is something more than just symbolism. I did initially think it was symbolic and what's the point of it? But actually, it seems to have had an impact on where it acts as a lever to impact and influence Israeli policy. Second thing is, in the immediate sense, I don't think it's going to resolve the immediate urgencies. And the immediate urgencies is to stop the atrocities, get humanitarian aid in, to stop the prevention of basic supplies of not just food, but medication. To ensure that there's access for journalists, people, monitors to see and make an assessment of the nature of the domicide, an accounting of the number of dead, being able to actually see what the impact is of this war on Palestinian societies and generations to come, and make that kind of determination, and actually go that step further and say, we're going to stop you from committing this genocide by all means that are legally at our disposal.
Mm-hmm.
And that has to take place, and it isn't taking place.
Mm-hmm.
And so a more immediate policy is focused around that. I saw something really silly recently saying about what stopped Bosnian genocide. And apparently it was because Muslims started arming Bosnia. It wasn't, because Muslims didn't start arming Bosnia. It's not true.
Yeah.
What it was the US and Clinton forcing after the most horrendous incidents in Srebrenica and so on,
Mm-hmm.
and the most horrendous actions that took place, to say, we're not going to allow this to persist and continue. And so there was a concerted effort to intervene to stop them, which eventually led to what we saw, the prosecutions and so on of Milosevic and Radovan Karadzic and so on, some of the crimes they committed. But actually, it was when the powers that have the ability to influence action decide to do something.
Mm-hmm. So just moving back to domestic politics, just for a last thing, because you did mention it, and I did want to get round to it. The new left wing party, the one which, and also which cannot be named because they haven't got a name for it. You know,
Yeah.
What's the point of that? Really, what's the point of that?
I think what it's symbolic of is the fracture between the people who identify as belonging to the left and the Labour leadership. I think there's a definite fracture there. Some of that is hard left candidates who've always been in the party and should have been kicked out years ago. I mean, I always had this with, I remember when Corbyn went on Russia Today after the chemical weapons attack in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
And he said he's just spoken to Russian intelligence, and they've told him that these bombs didn't come from the Syrian government. They basically came from Syrian opposition. So he was there spreading Russian disinformation on Russia Today as a senior MP. And he persisted in this kind of nonsense about Syrian people and defending Assad for years and years to come. And this kind of falls by the wayside because people think, well, he supports us on Palestine, right?
Yeah.
He didn't support you when Iran and Assad were bombing the Palestinian refugees in Yarmouk, and they had to en masse be, were forced, dispersed en masse from Yarmouk as a result. So it wasn't out of principle care for Palestinians. It's an ideopolitical position. It's why he was desperate to meet the Chinese premier when the Chinese government was coming to the UK, and will not speak out about the million plus Uyghur who are being in camps.
But there are other
by
people
the
in this
Chinese
party.
government.
But there are some other people in this party as well, aren't there? People who aren't necessarily
Who also share that sentiment about Palestine, but it doesn't translate into actually what does this mean for all these other issues. Because if they did, if the repugnance of what a person has done via the genocide of tens of thousands of Palestinians, how you see it, then 500,000 Syrians being killed, 100,000 being tortured to death, and 10 million being dispersed would bother you in multiples more because these people support it.
I mean, I
If
meant
you don't really care about
I meant more as okay.
I'm finished making my point. If you don't care about that, then you don't really care about these issues. You're just grifters.
Mm-hmm.
You're grifters. You're people that take the sentiments of people and you ride off it to get yourself into power.
Mm-hmm.
You're people that don't turn up for important electoral votes on debates about the Palestinian question. And you re-elected yourself on the premise of we're going to represent your sentiments about Palestinians and Palestine issue.
Mm-hmm.
They're grifters and they're horrendous liars, and they're people that have managed to navigate themselves into taking the sentiments and the emotions of people to ride off the back of them and enter parliament.
Because there are some of them who are, as you say, old hard lefties, but there's a bunch of them who are new intake. you
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
Um,
and I'm sure these people are sincere. It's not about their sincerity. It's just about, with some of them, it's about actually just they don't really understand politics. They don't really understand global affairs. They don't really understand the dynamics of how these things happen. And therefore, they've adopted this one issue and not others, frankly. When you see it with the way they will talk about all issues of harms to what our government has supported or Western powers have supported, and they'll be silent about that.
mm,
You know, you had our foreign minister wanting desperately to talk to the Assad regime about how to deal with refugees and migration. And that didn't bother any of these people to leave the party then. So I don't believe they have a conscience based on understanding. I think they may be sincere at best, but ill informed and lack of principle, but have ideology.
mm.
And I think that's part of the problem with fringe politics as opposed to principle stances.
I
Because
mean,
principle stances may leave you in a very lonely place, but you hold them and you articulate them and you put them forward and you seek to influence others rather than be influenced by other agendas.
what about, have they spoken anything about what their domestic agenda is going to be?
To be fair, I don't think they have a coherent set of policies on anything.
Mm,
And I think that's part of the problem with hard left politics anyway, is that it never translates into coherent sets of policies. I know there was a recent statement about, again, this kind of like traditional working class voters, that kind of dog whistle to the kind of like Brexiteer impulse.
mm.
But I think that's the only thing I've seen, to be honest.
Because I do remember some stuff
So
about the welfare
I could
reform.
have missed a great manifesto, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do remember some vague things about welfare reform, which was basically we're not going to reform anything. Um,
Yeah.
and that was
So
about
I
it,
thought
really.
welfare reform.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, I think that says everything, really, doesn't it? We're not going to reform anything as a radical left party. Surely you want to make things better.
Well, thank you very much for taking time out of your day to speak about
No worries.
these issues. Um, everybody who's listening, thanks for joining in on the live stream. You can always contact us. The contact details are on the website, atypicaldoctor.com. There's all come and join the conversation on the Atypical Doctor podcast. I am not necessarily going to do the whole YouTube, please like and subscribe, but it would be nice if you could like and subscribe. Thanks a lot, everyone. I think it's an important discussion that we've had. There may be things that I agree with Rashad on. There may be things that I don't agree with Rashad on. But it's a debate that needs to be had. And so thank you very much, everybody, for listening. And that, as they say, is a wrap. That's what clever people say anyway. What the heck's my... Yeah. How was that? Was that all right?
Yeah, I think it was all right. It's very long.
Yeah, it was a
How
little...
many people still stay on for that long?
Yeah, well, we'll find out. But we'll find out, I suppose, innit? I mean, to be fair, I think most people do just catch up on it afterwards. Okay, now how do I stop the blooming bot? Okay. Is it that one? 151
Yeah.
minutes? It wasn't 151 minutes. 1 hour 14. Yeah, that makes more sense.
Yeah,
Yeah, cool.
I guess because we started around 4 o'clock, right?
Yeah. And then, there might be a little bit of editing.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I better stop the stream. Hold on, I haven't actually stopped